Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, I'm excited to welcome you to today's Open Mind program with Dr. Nina Kraus, author of the groundbreaking new book of Sound Mind, How Our Brain Constructs a Meaningful Sonic World. Dr. Kraus is a scientist, author, inventor, and amateur musician who studies the biology of auditory learning. She's a professor at Northwestern University, where she holds the Hugh S. Knowles Chair in Audiology, and where she directs the Brainvolts Laboratory, where she and her colleagues investigate the neural encoding of speech and music and its plasticity, as well as numerous aspects of the auditory system. Dr. Kraus will be joined in discussion by Dr. Jude Tramo, who we are welcoming back for his third Open Mind appearance. Dr. Tramo is the director of the Institute for Music and Brain Science, the co-director of the University of California Multi-Campus Music Research Initiative, and both an associate clinical professor of neurology at UCLA's David Geffen School of Medicine and an adjunct professor in ethnomusicology at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. We are honored to have these two distinguished scholars, Dr. Kraus and Dr. Tramo, with us today to share their knowledge and expertise about sound and the brain. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping guidelines. Our program today will run for 1 hour, and the last 15 minutes are reserved for your questions. We ask that you please type your questions into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Today's program is being taped and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs, a calendar of upcoming events, information about the Friends Scholar Program, and about our Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held on April 28th. And submissions are due on March 11th, so students, please get those films in to be eligible. For those of you with us for the first time, today's program is part of our free Open Mind community lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders in science and culture for meaningful and relevant discussions about mental health issues. As with public radio or television, if you feel our Open Mind programming provides an important public service, we hope you will consider making a donation in support of it. Information is available on our website. And now, please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Nina Kraus and Dr. Mark Tramo. Thank you so much.
Well, hello there. I am very happy to be here together with Mark, and I will get to talk about my book of Sound Mind, which is my love letter to sound. And yeah, look, my friend made me a quilt. Pretty cool.
Just like the cover.
So I have to, I think what I want to do is start off with that very dreaded set of words. Let me share my screen just for 5 minutes, because I want to play some sounds for you. And then mostly what I'm really interested in is the conversation, the back and forth that Mark and I will have. And then I really welcome your questions. So here is my screen. All right, so you can see that if you go to our magical website, we study a lot of things at our lab, which is called Brainvolts. Music, concussion, bilingualism, aging, listening and noise, reading, all kinds of language disorders. And you might wonder, what are they doing at Brainvolts? Well, it's all under the umbrella of sound and the brain. And just to see here. This is the what I was hoping would be the cover of my book, because it really illustrates some of the wonder, the mystery, the spirituality of sound. And sound has been this path to the heavens as long as people have made it. But MIT wanted this cover, which is very nice. But I really wanted to put this information all in one place, because even though the topics are different, you will see how they really interrelate one to the other. And the first part of my book is how sound works. It's a story that I love to tell. I love to hear over and over again like a child. It's about sound waves and brain waves, and how we learn to connect what happens outside with what happens inside our heads. And that's the first part. And one of the things that comes out right away from the very beginning is the fact that the hearing brain is vast. And not only do we have pathways that connect the ear to the brain, but there are even more pathways that inform our hearing system about what we know, how we think, how we move, how we combine information from our other senses, and our feelings. So the hearing brain really is vast. And I want to give you an example. See if you can understand. There's a sentence embedded in this noise. And since I don't see anybody, I don't think anybody got it. But this is the sentence in there.
The juice of lemons makes fine punch.
Now listen to this again. So I hope that you believe me that what we know about sound influences how we hear it. Stop it. All right, there. So the more formal way of saying that our hearing brain engages how we think and feel and move and engage our other senses is we say it engages our cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems, which essentially is how we feel, how we think, how we combine our other senses, and how we move. Now, sound is invisible, so there's a lot we don't know about it, and it's one of the reasons that I think we don't recognize its importance as much. But think about powerful forces like gravity. Can't see that either. But sound consists of ingredients like pitch and timing and timbre. And I like to think about these sound ingredients entering our brain. And I like to use the metaphor of a mixing board. So depending on how we use sounds in our lives and sound, the faders on the mixing board go up and down in different ways that really personify how we hear the world. And what we can do is we can deliver sound with an earbud. And as I'm talking to you now, your brain is producing electricity, and we can capture that electricity just with sensors, with scalp electrodes, and we can get a response that looks very similar to the sound that we have delivered. And now I can look at the faders and see how good a job you're doing at processing these different ingredients. And we can listen to the brain. So in the same way as I'm talking now through a microphone, and the microphone is translating the sound waves into electricity and then into the speakers on your computer, you can be listening to sound as you're listening to me now, and of course your brain is producing electricity, and if I was picking that up, I could take that electricity and I could play it out through a speaker. So we can have fun with this. Here's a sound wave. Here's the brain's response. So So we have a lot to work with. This is my favorite. You hear Deep Purple first, and then the brain. Yeah. And this little clip here is from the Kennedy Center that I want to share with you.
So finally, we have science meets art. Here is the brain keyboard. And we have recorded the brain's response to every note on the keyboard. Can you play a couple notes for us? So this is the brain's response to individual notes. And now you will hear Mark Meadows play the brain. Thank you.
There we go. Now, the major part of my book is about how our life in sound shapes our brain. And each one of us, have our own sonic fingerprint. Here you can see the brain's response to speech. It's 6 different people. And if in the same way as if I ask you to repeat your signature, you're going to repeat more or less the same thing. If I now measure these guys' responses the next day, you'll see that they each have their own signature, and it's a pretty robust signature. So our sonic selves, this is 2/3 of the book, is about how our life in sound makes us us. There's a chapter on music, there's a chapter on rhythm. The root of language is sound. Music and language are a partnership. The bilingual brain, birdsong, noise, aging, sound and brain health with a spotlight on athletes and concussion. And then the last chapter is my call to action. It's really thinking about our sonic past, present, and future, and the kinds of decisions that we need to make and the kinds of choices that we have for living our life in sound. One of the very first, this is from my dissertation, I was recording from single neurons in the auditory cortex. And so here's a rabbit, here's a sound, and here is the response of the neuron. And once we taught the animal that the sound had a meaning, same animal, same sound, same neuron, but this made a really big impression on me. This showed me firsthand that the brain's response to sound changes, and it changes when sound to meaning connections are made. So, we study how the brains of people who spend a lot of time doing various things, what kinds of neural signatures do they have? What kind of impact does this have? Music is a great big one because, music is the jackpot when you think about cognitive, sensory, and reward systems. We've done a lot of work on music education in low-income areas. Here are some of the kids getting their brain responses measured. Done work on aging across the lifespan. A lot of our recent work has been on concussion. And you might wonder, well, wait a minute. Making sense of sound is one of the hardest jobs we ask our brain to do. So of course, when you get hit in the head, it's going to disrupt this very fine processing. And here are some of our adorable athletes. We're testing all of our Division I athletes, or Big Ten athletes, all 500 of them, males and females, over 5 years through an NIH-supported grant. And this is my last slide. And it is summing up another really important point of my book. So one is the hearing brain is vast. The other is sound connects us. Sound connects us the way nothing else does. And it is alive. It is this back and forth In a minute, I'll be talking to Mark, and he and I, we don't have a script. It's just a back and forth. It's alive. And for to me, probably the best example of this back and forth, what Ian McGilchrist calls betweenness, is singing harmony with somebody, where you're singing, you're listening, you're responding, you're going back and forth. And it's just this wonderful way that we can connect with each other, especially at a time when we are often kind of divisive. We should really think about how sound connects us. So I'm going to stop sharing, yay, and we can be off to the races.
Nina, thank you so much. We're approaching 300 participants in this open mind program for the Friends of the Semel. And we can't see everybody, but we can now envision everybody. And thank you so much for that beautiful overview of your book of Sound Mind. And I want to thank you for sharing with us this incredible fund of knowledge that you have about hearing and the brain mechanisms mediating all aspects of hearing, speech, music, voice, and then also for your intellectual curiosity. And because I enjoyed the breadth of the book and some of the anecdotes as they related to something I think all of us as readers can identify with at some level. In my classes at UCLA, I always ask guest professors about their developmental histories, since we're surrounded by so many, as you are at Northwestern, so many young people aged 22 to 18 or thereabouts. And maybe tell us a little bit about the story that I loved in the introduction, and Vicki Goodman loved in the introduction, how you came to really be captivated by sound and by music, and how early and special that, I guess, bicultural that was.
Yeah. So thank you for noticing the stories, the personal stories. And part of another message in my book is science is a deeply human endeavor. And we often forget that, but science is done by humans. And, you know, the fact that I started out, I grew up in a house where more than one language was spoken. My mom was a pianist. I loved to hang out under the piano, and it just felt so good. And so sound, I guess from the very beginning, must have really flowed into my sound mind. When I went to college, I majored in comparative literature because I knew some languages and I liked to read. And then I took biology with a distribution requirement. And I loved it. I thought, okay, this is it. I want to do this. Then I found a book by Lenberg called The Biological Foundations of Language. And I thought, oh, so, and again, everything that I do crosses boundaries, borders. And I think it may have to do with the way I grew up. You know, I don't feel Italian really. I don't feel American really, but I feel like.
So you actually spent a lot of time in Italy, embedded in the culture. Is that unlike
Italian's
me?
my first language. And I know you, Marco, you have Tramo. It's a nice, very, un bel nome italiano.
Oh, well, you see, I actually am, so Italian American, have barely really been in Italy, but it's fascinating that you saw that. You brought up something in your book, and I wanted to ask you about this. When the pandemic first started, the whole reason we're all here stuck on Zoom. But when the pandemic started and there was the shutdown in Italy, there were some pictures going around that at around 7 o'clock at night, I must have had some cousins there somewhere, that they would open up their windows and start playing music out on the street to overcome the feelings of isolation.
Yeah.
And then you also mentioned that change in the sound environment actually brought about a measurable change in birdsong.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could share your thoughts about what the Italians did at the start of the pandemic, as someone who is a member of the culture, has been, and then what the story about what happened with the birds.
Yeah. Well, so sound connects us. And I think when we're all cooped up and it's hard to connect, a way we can connect is to open our windows and say, "Hey, Mario, sing me a song." And, you can start singing a song together, and you can be together, you can be alive. I think that Italy began this singing at a certain time of night. But I think other places, certainly in New York City, there was some singing and sound making to thank all of the health workers that were really risking their lives to take care of sick people. So sound connects us, and a lot of people noticed during COVID that they could hear things that they didn't otherwise hear, like the birds. And what actually happened, and there was a beautiful article in Science about this, is that people measured the volume of the birds and their singing, and actually they were singing more quietly than they were before the pandemic. The reason being that they didn't have to scream over the roar of traffic and all the other sounds. So they were singing more quietly, but their sound was traveling farther, and they were singing a more intricate, beautiful song, because with birds, it's the males who sing and the females who choose. And if you're a female bird and the male bird is singing an intricate song, you like that. So the birds were actually able to sing sexier songs because they had the physical stamina. They didn't have to be screaming. They could, they could sing as best they could.
That brings to mind the idea that if you're in a hard rock band and you have a really loud drummer, you don't spend too much time playing 16th notes. So tell us about, there's a set of drums there behind you. I don't know if you want to show the
you see
crowd
them?
there.
You can see the bass drum a little bit, right? The outline.
Yep. And your brother is a musician, your mom's a musician. Oh, there we go.
See? And see, we got a piano over here, lots of instruments. Yeah. My husband's a musician, and fortunately I get to live with him. And he's been teaching over Zoom the whole pandemic. And so I get to hear a lot of really good live music, but all my kids play music. I play a bunch of instruments, not especially well, but with great joy.
So you talked about acquisition and development in the book. How old were you when you started? Which instruments did you start on, and how much has that had to do with the development of your scientific career?
Well, the first language that I probably learned, or one of the languages that I learned, was harmony. And I can just just sing harmony. I don't know how I do it, but it was something that my mom did with my dad, and it's a beautiful thing, just to kind of find where your part can fit in. So I think I was always, I'm sure, sung to and had my little baby feet clapped in time with something that my parents were singing. And but I took formal piano lessons. I guess I must have been 5 or 6. But don't think that you need to start early necessarily. I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is how our life in sound and our sound mind changes throughout our lives, and that we are able to learn. We can learn a musical instrument when we're very old. I mean, actually, I've started with drums not too long ago, and some harmonica just in the last couple of years. I'm an old lady, and so it's and I think Jimi Hendrix, he was a teenager when he started playing guitar. So we learn differently throughout our lives, but we always learn. And part of one of the stories that I tell in the book is about the owls, the owl story. How owls need to use sound to localize their prey, and you can fool the animal by putting prisms on that shift his visual field so that the sights and the sounds don't align. And a young animal will very quickly learn to realign his new visual field with, lunch in the brambles. And when they first tried this in older owls, the older owls didn't learn. But then they said, well, okay, instead of doing the entire shift of the visual field all at once, let's just shift it a couple of degrees at a time. And so they used less of a shift over time. And in the total amount of time that it took the young animals, it took the old animals to learn how to do this. They just learned it with a different strategy. And, so number one, we're all different at any age. But as we develop through our lives, our sound mind changes, because what is it that really makes us us? I mean, our memories, right? And our sonic memories are deeply a part of who we are, and they're different today than they were when you were a baby.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think I'd be doing this if it weren't for the Beatles. I mean, all of the work having to do with music and the brain happened to be growing up with the Beatles and starting guitar lessons the summer before the Ed Sullivan Show. I think that you mentioned in the book this connection with society, with socialization. Can you tell the audience a bit about that aspect of the book, how important socialization, and I think since you mentioned it in the introduction, the influence of positive reinforcement on how we react to sound.
Yeah. Funny you mentioned the Beatles and connection. This actually happened. One of the things that we did every summer and is we walked in the Dolomites in the mountains of Italy, and we would go from mountain hut to mountain hut and spend the nights there. And so one night we found ourselves in a mountain hut, and these mountain huts, you slept in bunk beds, with 40 people in a room if the place was that big. So, but every place had a guitar on the wall. And somebody, I don't know where he was from, I don't even think English was his first language, but he knew all the Beatles songs. And so did everybody else from Austria, from Hungary, from wherever they were coming from. And we all sang, we sang and sang. We didn't know each other, but boy, were we connected.
That's a beautiful story. So can you speculate about how social development, I mean, this is obviously a big concern over the past 2 years. You know, how music and the voice and vocalization plays such an important role in vocalization, and maybe in relation to facial perception and some analogies that might be there.
Yeah. I think more than ever, again, this is where we need to take charge of our lives in sound, our personal lives, for ourselves, for our children, for education, for medicine. We love technology. I mean, we are able to have this conversation because of technology. It's awesome. But we also have to be really careful. I keep seeing people with their kids, and I want to say, talk to your kid. Don't talk to your phone. And again, the linguistic stimulation is incredibly important. The personal connections. You see kids in restaurants, just with their little devices or in their stroller, instead of learning to listen, to pay attention to the conversations, to what is going on. So I think that we need to think about the choices that we make for ourselves and our kids. Certainly in terms of a musical education. So we've done a lot of work with kids, and one of the work that we've done in the various public school systems in Los Angeles and in Chicago was because the teachers came to us and they said, we already know that the kids who play music are the better students. What's going on in their brains? And so, we embarked on these longitudinal studies. So year after year, we had the kids who played music. We had kids, we'd matched the kids who played music with kids who had another enrichment activity that wasn't music. And over 5 years, we followed these kids. And in fact, the ones in Chicago, they were high school kids in underserved areas, kids who had never learned a musical instrument before in their lives. They were just starting as teenagers. And we could see in our Chicago public school teenagers and in the grammar school kids in LA that their responses to sound changed very, very measurably. I mean, what made them, their neural signature changed over time, over years. And importantly, the ingredients that were important and that were enhanced for music, notably the harmonics and various aspects of timing, that's not only good for music because it helps us, for example, the harmonics is what helps us distinguish the sound of a tuba from the sound of a flute, but the harmonics also help us distinguish a D from a B and a G. So the harmonics and aspects of timing are really important. The very same ingredients that are strengthened through making music are the ones that we need for language and language development and reading. So, this has a really pervasive effect. Deciding, I truly believe we have the science to back up why every child should have a musical education, why music should be considered in medicine. One of the reasons that I wrote the book in a conversational style. It's really written, for any, and I wanted any curious high school kid to be able to read it easily. But even though the style is conversational, 20% of the book is references. And so, I'm not just saying, I'm a biologist, I'm doing my best job pulling together the literature for you. And if I'm saying something, it's backed up by the very best things that we know today. And so, I'm trying to get the more understanding of how important sound is for so many parts of our lives, for our connections, for our development. And I think that at least for me, it makes a lot more sense if I understand, well, what's going on biologically. I mean, even just thinking about the fact that we have been talking to each other through sound for hundreds of thousands of years. Writing has only happened in the last 5,000 years. So, from a very deep evolutionary root, we are made to communicate through sound.
In that regard, can you tell us a little bit about emotional expression through sound and maybe related a bit to evolution?
Yeah. So we actually studied this. We were interested to know whether your experience with sound. So, by the way, when I talk about musicians, I'm not talking about professional musicians. I mean, yeah, sure, professional musicians count, but mostly I'm just talking about, anybody who regularly plays music for, I don't know, a little bit throughout the week, right? Um, and but we were wondering if people who played an instrument, of course, voice counts, very much so. Would they be better able to pick out the emotion in a baby's cry? So we worked with various labs that had emotionally tested sounds, and some of the sounds were, say, babies crying. And you want to be able to know by measuring the brain's response to the baby's cry whether you can pick up on the details that tell you, does your baby mean it? If your baby's crying in the night, do you need to get up and be with your baby, or would it be better for both of you if he just cried for a while and then you'll have a better day tomorrow? But you got to be able to understand that meaning, and that meaning actually is in the harmonics. And the people with musical experience were better able to do that. Evolutionarily, also, I mean, this has to do with emotion with respect to fear. We have depended for centuries and centuries and centuries on being able to sense danger, food, a mate, through nuances in sound in the environment. Again, this has very, very deep evolutionary roots that have to do with our feelings. And our feelings also, if you think about our noisy world, you talked about noise before. I maintain, and I try to make an argument for this in the chapter on noise, that we're in a constant state of alarm. Of course we're stressed, because even sounds that we sometimes don't even notice. When the truck outside turns off his ignition, or the air conditioner cycles off, you didn't even know it was there, but you kind of take a sigh of relief and realize that even though you weren't consciously aware of it, your body and your brain certainly was. And so again, these are choices that we can make, and we can ask ourselves, is this sound necessary? Can we, our sonic environment is so tricky, and it's so under-recognized because sound is invisible, and we live in a very visually biased world.
Nita, thank you so much. Again, I think we have a very lively chat Q&A I'm seeing with some really interesting questions. So let's turn it over to the audience and Vicky. And again, I want to thank you professionally for being so generous with sharing knowledge and being so knowledgeable, and taking on the effort as a active laboratory researcher, not just a book author, but someone who's really an empiricist who's done a lot of data collection and analysis. So thank you for all of that, Nina.
Well, thank you for all you do, Mark.
Well, and I would like to thank you both for sharing your knowledge and expertise. This was a fascinating discussion, and we do have 22 questions. We have a number of questions about people who are either hard of hearing or the brain of someone who is deaf. Is it different from those that of the hearing brain?
Well, so think of Beethoven. Beethoven was deaf. When he composed many of the most wonderful pieces of music we have had the pleasure to hear and to try to play. But I think that, you know, he personifies how the hearing brain is vast, and you know, the same areas in our brain that are active when we are playing music are active also when we are imagining music, when we are writing it down, when we are coordinating with other people, when we have certain feelings about the music. So I think that's a very important thing to be remembering, that the hearing brain really taps into what we know, but also reciprocally, if you have a hearing loss, you are not going to be, first of all, making those emotional connections, but importantly, how we hear is influenced by what we know. And we really do know that if you are not engaging with people through sound, you won't think as well. So it's important that we try to maximize our hearing, because it influences not just whether you can hear this thing, but it's whether you can think about this thing.
Thank you. We have a question from, it seems like a friend of yours and a past Open Mind speaker, Professor Marianne Wolf. Says, hello, dear Nina. Will you speak about the pivotal contribution of sound to the reading brain and to its impediments like dyslexia?
Well, Marianne Wolf has written the books on this topic, and we really do, you know, intersect in our different. One of the beautiful things about science is the converging evidence, right? And you know, she has done lines of work, as we have, and the field has, that has really brought us to the understanding that language is rooted in sound. And before we are able to make the connection between a symbol on a page and what it means, before we are able to read that, we have to make the connection between the sound and the symbol. So we need to be able to hear what a ba sounds like. And we need to be able to also, you know, I think a real myth in science has been that, you know, with sound kind of enters the ear and then is processed by the brain, and that's kind of it. Whereas in fact, what we learn as children. So think of the brain as a predicting organ. So think of the fact that you have learned language, you have learned sound to meaning connections throughout your whole life, even as a baby. You have spent a lot of time doing that. And so then finally, by the time you are getting ready to read, you already know all these things, and you are able to make the kinds of connections between, oh yeah, that sound, ba 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 ba, that's going to look like this. And so, it already early on, it comes from the sound to meaning connections that we have made. We have begun them in the womb. A baby 3 months in gestation is hearing his mommy's heart, and is hearing the sounds outside to the extent that they are heard in the womb. So right away, sound to meaning connections are being made deeply, deeply in sound, which is very important for eventually learning to read, which we know is something that humans learn to do much later on in evolution and development.
Thank you. There are a number of questions here about sound sensitivity, people with autism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So remember, I talked about the different ingredients that are in sound, and and that's a kind of an abstract idea for some people, because visually, so I got this thing, and it's got a size, a shape, a color, a texture. These are ingredients, and they're really obvious. In sound, there are ingredients like pitch, timing, timbre, phase, loudness, and they are just as vivid and tremendously important. And a child on the autism spectrum, we have learned, is pretty good at processing the harmonics in sound and a lot of the timing elements in sound. But they are not, some kids on the autism spectrum have difficulty following the music of speech. So in other words, the trajectory of the pitch. A person on the autism spectrum often has difficulty understanding how you mean it. Not what you said, but how you mean it. So for example, if you take a simple pitch trajectory, like I'm asking a question, going up, or I'm making a statement, you have a sound like that, and you measure the brain's response to that pitch trajectory, that pitch change, and a typically developing kid is going to follow that pitch change very well. But a child on the autism spectrum, again, not every child, because we're all different, and there are many reasons and many different kinds of autistic behavior. But what wonderful information to have to know, my child is really having difficulty processing these pitch trajectories, so he's going to have a hard time understanding what people mean. And this is also something that can be worked on, because as I was able to see firsthand with my bunny rabbits, the hearing brain is able to change based on what we give it.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina. We have a couple of questions about practical applications for sound therapy applicable to trauma. One from a trauma psychotherapist, and I wonder if you could speak about that.
Yeah. So music therapy has now increasingly been used for all kinds of neurological and psychological disorders. The part that I know best is, so we're doing work with with athletes, with elite athletes who get concussions, and so they get a form of brain injury, of brain trauma, that we can see in their brain's response to sound. Now, it is my view, and I'm hoping that someday the NIH will sponsor, will fund us to really do this study so that it isn't just preliminary. We can see that rhythm is a very promising way of healing the brain and healing, because there are rhythms in sound, but there are also rhythms in the brain. The brain operates on slow and very fast time scales. And one of the problems that happens with various head injuries is a desynchronization and a difficulty focusing, a difficulty attending to what is going on, to the sensory environment. And there is some hope and some expectation that rhythm therapies, and they can be, in the form, there's no better rhythm than making music. But of course, if you've just had a head injury, you're probably not the best time to learn a musical instrument. But there are computer-based programs for auditory training, rhythm programs like interactive metronome that can teach somebody very much like a therapy. It's it's a program like interactive metronome is boring. It's like doing leg lifts, but it's important and it helps to heal. Now, this really was not the question that I was asked, because I think the person asking may be talking about psychological trauma, which again, the hearing brain is vast. So everything we know about how tied in sound is to our feelings would make me think, and certainly the music therapists who do this for a living can speak to how rhythm and music can be used in various neurological and psychological, psychiatric problems.
Thank you, Nina. There are a couple of comments here going back to Beethoven. One, that Beethoven was not born deaf. And the other says Beethoven put his head on the piano to hear his compositions, when in fact he would have been feeling his compositions. And that reminds me a little bit of when you talk in your book about, or maybe it was in the Kennedy Center, when you talk about lying under the piano when your mom was playing, how you felt the music.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could go back.
Yeah. Well, let's take this back to an evolutionary perspective. Even, the hearing organ evolved from organisms needed to be able to be upright, and they needed to move. And so, in fact, these hairs and hair cells that eventually turn into our ears and sensory organs in there are very evolutionarily old, and again, very, very tied to feeling. So there are people who have made wristwatches for the profoundly deaf. And what they do is they translate the patterns of sound vibrations into movement of the skin. And deaf people are able to learn, oh yeah, that's a dog barking, that's whatever it is. And clearly there is a feeling component, a somatosensory component to the hearing. So I certainly Beethoven and anyone who is hard of hearing, often people who are hard of hearing still have considerable hearing in some of the lower vibratory frequencies. And there's a lot of information that can be gotten from that. But even if you have, I mean, think of a cochlear implant. So, I mean, the cochlear implant to me is a testament of how we hear with our brains. So here you bypass the ear with a handful of electrodes, and now you are stimulating the brain directly with these. The sound has been turned into electricity, bypassing the ear, and it's stimulating the brain, and somehow the brain learns to make sense of this. Now, if someone becomes deaf later in life, they learn to, first things sound really weird, but they learn, oh, that's the sound of my husband's voice. Oh, that's the Beatles song. And so they have these memories. But I've got to tell you that the people who are doing best of all with cochlear implants are babies who are starting really early in life, and they have been born deaf, and they start with a cochlear implant, and before long they are having conversations with you without even seeing your face. It's truly, I mean, the first time I talked to somebody over the phone, this was 20 years ago now, a woman who had a cochlear implant, and we were just talking on the phone, and I mean, I just cried. It was just incredible how we had a perfectly good, easy to understand, back and forth conversation. So I think a big message is we hear with our brain. The other thing is for people who get hearing aids, first of all, hearing aids, speech and music are different, and hearing aids are not made for music especially well. So some people may decide to only use their hearing aids for speech and turn them off when they're playing music or their various music settings. But I think most important, people go get their hearing aids and then they give up, because it's not like putting on your glasses. Suddenly you have to learn to hear all over again, because the sounds that you weren't hearing before, you're now hearing, the air conditioner and all kinds of sounds that you need to learn to tune out. You need to learn, you have to learn to hear through this device, which the brain will do. But fortunately, the brain doesn't change every second. It takes time to change the brain. And we saw this even, in our work with children in Los Angeles and in Chicago. After 1 year of music making, we didn't see any fundamental changes in how their brain processed sound. It was after a year that their whole signature changed. So it takes a while. And as the brain continues to make these sound to meaning relationships, and I think that it's very important that if somebody gets a hearing aid, that they be counseled to stick with it.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I have to say, Dr. Kraus, your passion for your work comes through even through a Zoom screen. So thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for the opportunity to learn from you. Mark, you are the quintessential faculty discussant, asking the most pertinent and relevant questions. So thank you for that, for your third appearance with us. Really want to thank you both. This was just a fascinating discussion. I want to thank everybody that listened in today. It was really a privilege to hear this discussion. I hope that everybody will come back on Thursday, March the 3rd, when our speaker will be Dr. Anna Lemke, who wrote the book Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And you may have seen Dr. Lemke. She was recently on the Netflix show about social media, Social Dilemma. So thank you. Thank you again. Thank you so much. And everybody stay safe and stay well. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.